This is truly a classic brand right here, Johnson & Johnson. Probably like many of the people watching this, I've always associated them with Johnson's baby powder, which has actually become quite a controversial product. Sales of it have been down for a while because thousands of lawsuits have been filed by women claiming that the use of it has led to ovarian cancer. Now, the company says that it's completely safe. There doesn't seem to be any definitive answers about it yet, but due to all of these issues, in May of 2020, Johnson & Johnson announced that they will no longer be selling it in North America, which is big because they've been selling this stuff since 1894, though I highly doubt that this change will have any noticeable impact for them because Johnson & Johnson is huge. If you're one of the people who mostly associates them with this baby powder or maybe one or two other things, you are about to be surprised. Maybe the biggest reflection of their size and stability is the fact that they are one of the 30 companies that make up the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That right there is an exclusive list, and simply put, it means that their performance is thought to be reflective of the market in general. They have been on the stock market since 1944 and are currently valued at hundreds of billions of dollars. When ranked by revenue on the Fortune 500 list, they are number 35, just ahead of State Farm Insurance, Target, and IBM. And that ranking has not changed much over the past couple of decades. They've had a couple declining years, but generally increasing to the $82 billion that they're at today. Actually, before 2008, for 76 consecutive years, their revenue was higher than the year before it. More impressive financial information is that they've increased their dividend for the past 57 years. They can afford to do it because they're pretty much always profitable, typically earning well over $10 billion every year. Now, I'll bet that I've already convinced many of you that Johnson & Johnson is in fact bigger than you realized, but there's so much more to talk about. I don't want to overhype them too much, but I think we're safe to say that they are among the most innovative and just important companies to ever exist. They started back in the 1800s, quickly made a significant impact to the medical industry, and have since either invented or acquired multiple successful brands that we still know today. Before I talk about them any further, I need to go back to the days of President Lincoln and the American Civil War. See, back then, when it came to treating wounded soldiers, it was scary. Seriously, you did not want to get hurt in any way, because the state of medicine, I'll say it, was dangerous. Infections were the big concern because the medical community didn't really understand them, so it was common practice to just cut off someone's limb as an attempt to prevent an infection from spreading. But then that's tricky too, because many times the amputation procedure itself would lead to a life-threatening infection. There were scientists at the time conducting research and figuring out that germs were causing these infections, notably Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister. Lister was a big advocate of sterile surgery, just making sure everything was clean and sterile before conducting surgery. His method was pretty much spraying absolutely everything with carbolic acid, which turns out wasn't the best answer, but it did reduce the infection rates. I know that this all seems so obvious to us, but at first, people generally didn't believe in it. His ideas were seen as new and radical, and the medical community was not convinced. Getting back to Johnson & Johnson, despite the name, there are actually 3 Johnson brothers that are significant here. We have James Wood Johnson, Robert Wood Johnson, and Edward Meade Johnson. The famous logo that we all know was based on the signature of James Wood, a talented engineer, but Robert Wood was more at the center of things. See, James and Edward were actually involved in the war, while Robert was still too young. Instead, at 16 years old, he first got involved in the industry of medicine when he became an apprentice at a relative's pharmacy in New York. About a decade later, he started his own company with a partner that produced these patches that you put on your skin and they would deliver medicine. It was more common back then. And it wasn't long before his 2 brothers joined the business, offering their respective talents, and they were all working together. In 1876, a few years after he started this business, Robert attended a life-changing lecture by none other than Joseph Lister. He was up there talking about what many people viewed as his wild, sterile surgery ideas, but Robert was convinced. 10 years later, when it was all just starting to become more and more accepted, he and his 2 brothers started Johnson & Johnson as the world's first company to mass-produce antiseptic surgical supplies. Honestly, I'm having a hard time with some of this because it it is horrifying to think of what some of these doctors were doing before this. They were using cotton straight from the fields with dirt in it, and they would close wounds using threads from sewing kits. They would use a typical sea sponge and then reuse it on the next patient. Knowing what we know today, this craziness. Early on, Johnson & Johnson would pretty much produce the safe, antiseptic version of all of these supplies. As the medical community finally realized the need for these products, the company continued to grow because they were the first and only ones supplying them on a large scale. In 1888, they actually sold the first commercial first aid kit. It was targeted toward railroad workers who would be working out in the middle of nowhere, and in that same year, they published Modern Methods of Antiseptic Wound Treatment. It was basically a guide that soon became the standard as far as how to safely treat wounds and perform surgery. I can't even imagine how many lives were being saved as a result of their products, and you can see how they would logically grow from here, just introducing countless new products for various medical uses. Some notable ones would be that baby powder that I already mentioned, introduced in 1894, the same year as their maternity kit. Babies were commonly born at home back then, so they sold this kit that contained all the stuff you needed to safely get through it. Another massive one would be the Band-Aid. It was introduced in 1921 as a way for people to treat their own cuts. This guy, Earl Dixon, who worked for the company, invented an initial version of it for that very reason. I guess his wife would cut herself while cooking so often that it motivated him to invent something where she could take care of those cuts by herself. The company saw potential for it and released it as their new product, which, by the way, has since become one of the most well-known products of all time. Band-Aid is the Johnson & Johnson brand name, but even when we're buying a different brand, we still call it a Band-Aid. Alright, let me go a little faster with some of these brands. Another huge one was in 1958 when they made their first big push into the pharmaceutical industry when they bought McNeil Laboratories. They were the makers of Tylenol. It's an aspirin-free pain reliever that I'm sure we all know about, so for the past 6 decades or so, any Tylenol branded product has been produced and sold by a division of Johnson & Johnson. It was actually only available with a prescription before their involvement, but within a year of them owning it, it was available over the counter. Jumping ahead a bit, in 1989, they started a joint venture with another drug company that resulted in the creation of Pepcid and Mylanta. Then in 2011, they bought the full ownership of that company. In 1991, they bought Clean & Clear. In 1994, they bought Neutrogena for over $900 million. In 1997, they bought Motrin in exchange for some of their other brands. In 1999, they bought the skincare business of S.C. Johnson for an undisclosed amount, which mainly consisted of the brand Aveeno. Still, in 1999, they introduced Splenda, the no-calorie sweetener that they sold in 2015. But all of this was leading up to a much bigger acquisition in 2006. That is when they paid almost $17 billion for the consumer health unit of Pfizer. That deal gave Johnson & Johnson control of the brands Benadryl, Sudafed, Bengay, Neosporin, Visine, and Listerine, among others. So I would say that is an impressive assortment of products. Just let me restate all of the ones that I've already mentioned because I think it's more impactful hearing them all together. Alright, here we go. We have Johnson's baby powder, Band-Aids, Tylenol, Pepcid, Mylanta, Clean & Clear, Neutrogena, Motrin, Aveeno, Splenda, Benadryl, Sudafed, Bengay, Neosporin, Visine, Listerine. There are so many others as well. They have over 100 different products. There's Lubriderm, Rogaine, Nicorette. These are just the ones that I found to be the largest or the most recognizable. But here's the thing, that entire list, along with 100 or so other brands, falls under their consumer sales division, which in 2019 accounted for only $14 billion of their $82 billion in sales, meaning it all only represents about 17% of their business. It is their smallest segment. Their largest segment is pharmaceutical sales, representing over half of their revenue. They provide all of these drugs that I doubt you've ever encountered unless you've had the need to take one of them. They make them for all kinds of diseases and conditions, so just know that if your doctor prescribes you a medicine, there is a fair chance that it came from Johnson & Johnson. The remaining segment is medical devices, representing almost a third of their revenue. This one consists of things like joint replacements, screws, plates, even contact lenses. In 1981, 1981, they acquired the company Frontier Contact Lenses, and by 1988, they introduced the popular brand AccuView. In fact, most of their bigger acquisitions over the years have involved these segments rather than the consumer products. In 1996, they paid $1.8 billion for a company that focused on treating cardiovascular diseases. 2 years later, they bought this orthopedics company for $3.7 billion, which was their biggest acquisition to that point. In 2001, they bought a company that focused on drug delivery methods for $12.3 billion, which again was their largest acquisition to that point. In 2011, they did it a third time when they bought a maker of medical devices for $19.7 billion, again their largest acquisition to that point. And then more recently, they bought a pharmaceutical company for about $30 billion. So to summarize, and I guess my point to this whole video is that Johnson & Johnson is probably bigger and more significant than you may have realized. Going all the way back to the late 1800s, when surprisingly few people cared about sterilizing cuts and wounds, Johnson & Johnson was out there starting a business centered around that very thing. All of those years, and the ones following, were filled with acquisitions and internal inventions, such as the Band-Aid, that have led to this multi-billion-dollar company that they are today. Let me know in the comments, what were you most surprised to hear from this video? I realize that the state of medicine back then is disturbing, but I'm asking more along the lines of Johnson & Johnson. I think it's one of these companies that we've always known is around, but we haven't thought too much about it, and they deserve some attention, so I hope this helps with that. Also, what do you think of the company? They've had their share of scandals and callbacks, but there's a lot of positives to point to as well. How does it all weigh out in your mind? And any other thoughts you have about Johnson & Johnson, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.